Hey there, you're looking kind of cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out all my other socials. Enjoy. The sound of a key turning in the lock sent a jolt of panic through Alyssa's body. She froze, one hand still adjusting the auburn wig perched atop her head, eyes wide with terror as she stared at her reflection in the full-length mirror. The door creaked open behind her. "Mr. Thompson, I'm here to check on that leak you reported," a stern voice called out. Alyssa's heart pounded in her chest as she slowly turned to face her landlady, Ms. Harrington. The older woman stood in the doorway, her hand still on the doorknob, mouth agape as she took in the sight before her. I can explain," Alyssa stammered, painfully aware of how she must look. A man in his mid-30s, dressed in a flowing red cocktail dress, teetering on black stiletto heels, face carefully made up with smoky eyeshadow and ruby red lipstick. Mrs. Harrington's eyes narrowed as she stepped into the apartment, closing the door behind her with a soft click. "I should certainly hope so, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice low and controlled, "because I'm having a hard time understanding what I'm seeing here." Alyssa swallowed hard, fighting the urge to run and hide. Instead, she took a deep breath and gestured toward the small sofa in the living room. "Perhaps we should sit down. This might take a while to explain." The landlady nodded curtly and moved to take a seat, her eyes never leaving Alyssa as she perched on the edge of the couch, hands folded primly in her lap. Alyssa gingerly lowered herself into the armchair across from her, careful not to wrinkle her dress. "Well," Mrs. Harrington prompted after a moment of tense silence. "I'm waiting." Alyssa closed her eyes briefly, gathering her courage. When she opened them again, she met Mrs. Harrington's gaze steadily. "My name is Alyssa," she began softly. "At least, that's who I am on the inside. I've felt this way for as long as I can remember, but I've never had the courage to be myself outside of these four walls." Mrs. Harrington's expression remained impassive as Alyssa continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I know it must seem strange to you, but when I dress like this, I finally feel like my true self. It's not about anything inappropriate. It's just about being comfortable in my own skin." As Alyssa spoke, she noticed a subtle shift in Mrs. Harrington's demeanor. The older woman's rigid posture softened slightly, and a flicker of something, understanding perhaps, passed through her eyes. "I see," Mrs. Harrington said slowly when Alyssa had finished. She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze thoughtful as she studied Alyssa. "And how long have you been... Alyssa? In private?" "For years," Alyssa admitted. "But I've never had the courage to go out like this. I'm afraid of how people might react." Mrs. Harrington nodded, a hint of sympathy creeping into her expression. "It can be a cruel world out there, that's for certain." She paused, then asked, "Does anyone else know about this?" Alyssa shook her head. "No, you're the first person who's ever seen me like this. I never intended for anyone to find out, especially not like this. I'm so sorry for the shock, Mrs. Harrington. I understand if you want me to move out." To Alyssa's surprise, Mrs. Harrington waved away the suggestion. "Nonsense. You've been a model tenant, always paid your rent on time. What you do in the privacy of your own home is your business." She hesitated, then added, "Though I must say, if you're going to present as a woman, there are a few things we need to address." Alyssa blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "I'm sorry?" Mrs. Harrington stood up, gesturing for Alyssa to do the same. "Stand up, dear. Let me have a look at you." Bewildered, Alyssa rose to her feet. Mrs. Harrington circled her slowly, eyeing her critically from head to toe. The dress is lovely, but it doesn't quite fit you properly. And those shoes? How on earth do you walk in those?" "Not very well," Alyssa admitted, with a sheepish smile. "I'm still practicing." Mrs. Harrington nodded decisively. "Right. Well, if you're serious about this, you'll need some help. Proper fitting clothes, shoes you can actually walk in, and we'll need to do something about that wig. It's not bad, but it could be better." Alyssa stared at her landlady in disbelief. You want to help me? Why not? Mrs. Harrington shrugged. I may be old-fashioned in some ways, but I'm not completely ignorant. If this is who you truly are, then you deserve to be the best version of yourself. Tears welled up in Alyssa's eyes. I don't know what to say. Thank you, Mrs. Harrington. I never expected... Now, none of that, Mrs. Harrington said briskly, though her tone was kind. If we're going to do this, we'll do it properly. First things first, we need to get you some clothes that actually fit. Do you have any other outfits? Alyssa nodded, gesturing toward the closet. A few. I've been collecting pieces here and there, but I'm not always sure what works. Show me, Mrs. Harrington instructed. Over the next hour, Alyssa's small apartment turned into an impromptu fashion show. Mrs. Harrington proved to have a keen eye for style and fit, offering frank but constructive criticism on each outfit. She vetoed a garish floral print dress. It looks like my grandmother's curtains, dear, but praised a simple black pencil skirt and white blouse combination. Now that's more like it, Mrs. Harrington nodded approvingly. Classic, elegant. You could wear that to the office and no one would bat an eye. Alyssa smoothed down the skirt, a smile playing on her lips. I've always loved this outfit, but I wasn't sure if it was too, boring. Nonsense. There's a difference between boring and timeless. This is the latter. Mrs. Harrington paused, then added, I have a friend who runs a boutique. She specializes in clothing for women with your particular needs. Perhaps we could pay her a visit. Alyssa's eyes widened. You mean, go out? Like this? Mrs. Harrington raised an eyebrow. Well, you can hardly go as Mr. Thompson, can you? Besides, if you're ever going to feel comfortable being Alyssa in public, you need to start somewhere. Why not start with a safe, understanding environment? The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Alyssa had dreamed of going out as herself for years, but the thought of actually doing it made her stomach churn with anxiety. I don't know if I'm ready, she admitted. Nonsense, Mrs. Harrington said firmly. You'll never be ready if you don't take that first step, and you won't be alone. I'll be with you every step of the way. Alyssa took a deep breath, considering the offer. The thought of having someone to guide her, someone who accepted her for who she was incredibly tempting. Okay, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Let's do it. Mrs. Harrington smiled, a warm, genuine expression that transformed her usually stern features. Excellent. Now, let's see about fixing that makeup. You've done a decent job, but there's room for improvement. Over the next hour, Mrs. Harrington proved to be a fountain of knowledge about makeup application. She showed Alyssa how to contour her face to soften her angular jaw, how to apply eyeshadow to make her eyes pop, and how to choose the right shade of lipstick to complement her skin tone. There, Mrs. Harrington said at last, stepping back to admire her handiwork. Have a look. Alyssa turned to the mirror and gasped. The woman staring back at her was still recognizably herself, but somehow more. Her features were softer, more feminine, her eyes bright and expressive. It's amazing, she breathed. I can't believe that's me. Believe it, dear, Mrs. Harrington said, a note of pride in her voice. That's the real you shining through. Now, shall we see about getting you some proper clothes? Alyssa nodded, a mixture of excitement and nervousness fluttering in her stomach. Yes, I think I'm ready. Mrs. Harrington helped Alyssa choose an outfit for their outing, the black pencil skirt and white blouse, paired with a modest pair of low heels. Baby steps, she said when Alyssa eyed her stilettos longingly. Let's make sure you can walk comfortably before we tackle those again. As they prepared to leave, Alyssa paused at the door, her hand hovering over the doorknob. What if someone recognizes me? She asked, her voice small. Mrs. Harrington placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Then we'll deal with it together. Remember, you have nothing to be ashamed of. You're simply being true to yourself. Taking a deep breath, Alyssa nodded and opened the door. The hallway beyond seemed to stretch endlessly, but with Mrs. Harrington by her side, she found the courage to take that first step. The journey to the boutique was a blur of nervous energy for Alyssa. Every glance from a passerby, every distant laugh, sent her heart racing. But Mrs. Harrington remained a steady presence at her side, her calm demeanor acting as a buffer against the world. The boutique, when they arrived, was a small, discreet shop tucked away on a quiet side street. A small bell tinkled as they entered, and a woman with short silver hair looked up from behind the counter. "Evelyn!" she exclaimed, her face lighting up at the sight of Mrs. Harrington. "What a lovely surprise. And who's this you've brought with you?" Mrs. Harrington gently urged Alyssa forward. "Margaret, I'd like you to meet Alyssa. She's in need of some guidance in building her wardrobe." Margaret's warm smile never faltered as she looked Alyssa up and down. "Well, you've certainly come to the right place, dear. Why don't you tell me a bit about your style preferences while I take some measurements?" Over the next few hours, Alyssa found herself in a whirlwind of fabrics, colors, and styles she'd never dared to explore before. Margaret and Mrs. Harrington worked together seamlessly, pulling pieces that complemented Alyssa's body type and coloring. "Try this," Margaret said, handing Alyssa a deep green wrap dress. "The color will bring out your eyes, and the cut will give you some curves." Alyssa emerged from the dressing room a few minutes later, tugging self-consciously at the hem of the dress. But when she caught sight of herself in the full-length mirror, she gasped. The dress hugged her body in all the right places, creating the illusion of a waist and hips she didn't actually possess. "Oh my," Mrs. Harrington said softly. "Alyssa, you look stunning." Margaret nodded in agreement. "That dress was made for you, dear. How does it feel?" "It feels right," Alyssa said, a smile spreading across her face, like I'm finally seeing the real me. By the time they left the boutique, Alyssa had a wardrobe that would rival any fashionable woman's closet. Classic pieces mixed with a few trendier items, all tailored to fit her perfectly. Margaret had even thrown in a few accessories, scarves, jewelry, and a beautiful leather handbag. "On the house for a first-time customer," she'd said with a wink. As they made their way back to Alyssa's apartment, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in vibrant shades of pink and orange. Alyssa found herself walking with a new confidence, her head held high. "Thank you," she said softly to Mrs. Harrington, "for everything. I never thought I'd have the courage to do this." Mrs. Harrington patted her arm gently. "You've always had the courage, dear. You just needed a little push. And perhaps a fairy godmother or two," she added with a chuckle. As they approached Alyssa's building, a familiar figure was just exiting. Alyssa froze, recognizing her neighbor, Mr. Chen. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her, but then she felt Mrs. Harrington's steady presence beside her, and she took a deep breath. Mr. Chen looked up as they approached, his brow furrowing slightly in confusion. "Good evening, Mrs. Harrington," he said politely, then turned to Alyssa. "I'm sorry, have we met? You look familiar." Alyssa swallowed hard, then straightened her shoulders. "Hello, Mr. Chen? It's me, Xander Thompson, though I prefer Alyssa now." Mr. Chen's eyes widened in surprise, but to Alyssa's relief, there was no disgust or anger in his expression, just curiosity. "Oh, well, it's nice to meet you, Alyssa. That's a lovely dress." "Thank you," Alyssa said, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "It's new." Mr. Chen smiled warmly. "Well, it suits you. Have a good evening, ladies." With a nod, he continued on his way. As they watched him go, Mrs. Harrington squeezed Alyssa's arm. "You see, the world isn't always as frightening as we imagine it to be." Back in her apartment, surrounded by her new clothes, and with the memory of the day's events swirling in her mind, Alyssa felt a sense of peace she'd never experienced before. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen and accepted. "What happens now?" she asked Mrs. Harrington as the older woman prepared to leave. Mrs. Harrington smiled. "Now, my dear, you live. You be yourself, unapologetically and beautifully. And if you ever need support or advice, you know where to find me." As the door closed behind Mrs. Harrington, Alyssa turned to look at herself in the mirror. The woman who gazed back at her was confident, happy, and finally truly herself. With a smile, Alyssa whispered to her reflection, "Nice to meet you, Alyssa. I think we're going to get along just fine." In the weeks that followed, Alyssa's life underwent a dramatic transformation. With Mrs. Harrington's continued guidance and support, she gradually began to live more openly as herself. It started small, venturing out to the corner store for milk, taking a walk in the park on a sunny afternoon. Each successful outing built her confidence a little more. Mrs. Harrington proved to be an invaluable mentor, offering advice on everything from voice modulation to proper posture. Shoulders back, chin up, she'd remind Alyssa gently. You have nothing to be ashamed of. One particularly memorable afternoon, Mrs. Harrington invited Alyssa to join her for tea at a quaint little cafe downtown. Alyssa arrived wearing a pale blue sundress and low heels, her auburn hair styled in soft waves around her face. "You look lovely, dear," Mrs. Harrington said warmly as Alyssa took her seat. "That color is perfect on you." Alyssa smiled, smoothing her skirt nervously. "Thank you. I'm still getting used to being out in public like this." "You're doing wonderfully," Mrs. Harrington assured her. "Now shall we order?" Their scones are to die for. As they sipped their tea and nibbled on delicate pastries, Alyssa found herself relaxing. The other patrons paid them no mind, absorbed in their own conversations and devices. It was just another ordinary afternoon tea between friends. "You know," Mrs. Harrington said thoughtfully, setting down her cup, "I've been thinking, have you considered looking for a job where you can be Alyssa full-time?" Alyssa blinked in surprise. I hadn't really thought about it," she admitted. "Do you think that's possible?" Mrs. Harrington nodded. "Of course it is. You're intelligent, capable, and now you have a wardrobe that would be the envy of any office. Why shouldn't you pursue a career as your true self?" The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Alyssa had been working freelance from home for years, partly to avoid the discomfort of presenting as male in an office environment. The thought of finding a job as Alyssa was daunting, but also incredibly appealing. "I wouldn't even know where to start," Alyssa said. "Well, what are your skills? What kind of work do you enjoy?" Mrs. Harrington prompted. Alyssa considered for a moment. "I've always loved writing. In fact, I've been working on a novel in my spare time." Mrs. Harrington's eyes lit up. "Perfect! I have a friend who works at a publishing house. They're always looking for fresh talent. Why don't I give her a call?" Before Alyssa could process what was happening, Mrs. Harrington had pulled out her phone and was dialing a number. "Hello, Diane. It's Evelyn. Listen, I have a promising young writer here who I think you'd be interested in meeting." 2 weeks later, Alyssa found herself sitting in the lobby of Starlight Publishing, a portfolio of her work clutched tightly in her hands. She wore her green wrap dress, the one that had made her feel so confident in Margaret's boutique, with a pair of modest heels and subtle makeup. "Ms. Thompson?" A friendly-looking woman with curly brown hair approached. "I'm Diane Roberts. It's so nice to meet you." Alyssa stood, extending her hand. "It's lovely to meet you too, Ms. Roberts. Thank you so much for agreeing to see me." Diane waved away the formality. "Please call me Diane. Any friend of Evelyn's is a friend of mine. Now why don't you come to my office and we can chat about your work?" As they settled into Diane's cozy office, Alyssa felt her nerves begin to settle. Diane had a warm, easy manner that put her at ease, and she found herself opening up about her passion for writing. "I've always loved creating worlds and characters," Alyssa explained. "There's something magical about bringing a story to life on the page." Diane nodded, her eyes sparkling with interest. "I couldn't agree more. Now, Evelyn mentioned you're working on a novel?" Alyssa took a deep breath. "Yes, it's a story about transformation, about finding the courage to be your true self, even when the world doesn't understand." "That sounds fascinating," Diane said. "And timely, too. We're always looking for diverse voices and unique perspectives in the publishing world. Would you be comfortable sharing some of your work with me?" With slightly trembling hands, Alyssa opened her portfolio and passed over a few sample chapters. As Diane read, her expression grew increasingly animated. By the time she looked up, she was beaming. "Alyssa, this is excellent work," she said. "Your voice is fresh, your characters are compelling, and the theme... Well, it's clear this comes from a very personal place." Alyssa nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and vulnerability. "It does. In fact, in many ways, it's my story." Diane's smile softened with understanding. "I see. Well, I think it's a story that needs to be told. I'd love to read more if you're willing to share it." By the end of the meeting, Alyssa left with not just a request for her full manuscript, but also an offer for an entry-level position in the editorial department. "We always need sharp eyes and good writers," Diane had said, "and I have a feeling you'll bring a unique perspective to our team." As Alyssa stepped out onto the busy street, she felt as though she was walking on air. For the first time in her life, she had a clear path forward, one where she could be herself, pursue her passion, and maybe even make a difference in the world. She pulled out her phone to call Mrs. Harrington and share the good news. As she dialed, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in a store window. The woman looking back at her was smiling, confident, and radiant with joy. It was Alyssa, the real Alyssa, finally stepping into the light. "Hello, Mrs. Harrington." You'll never guess what happened. As the weeks turned into months, Alyssa's life continued to evolve in ways she never could have imagined. Her job at Starlight Publishing proved to be everything she'd hoped for, and more. Her colleagues were welcoming and supportive, and she found herself thriving in the creative, fast-paced environment. Her novel, too, was progressing well. Diane had been true to her word, reading the full manuscript and offering invaluable feedback. "We're going to need to polish it up a bit," she'd said, "but I truly believe this book has the potential to touch a lot of lives." Outside of work, Alyssa was slowly but surely building a life as her true self. She'd joined a local writing group where she'd made a few close friends who knew and accepted her for who she was. She'd even started volunteering at a local shelter, helping other individuals who were struggling with their identity. One sunny Saturday afternoon, Alyssa found herself sitting in her favorite cafe, working on the final edits of her novel. She was so engrossed in her work that she didn't notice someone approaching her table until a familiar voice spoke. "Alyssa, is that you?" She looked up to see Mr. Chen Mr. Chen, her neighbor, standing there with a friendly smile. "Oh, hello, Mr. Chen," she said, returning his smile. "Yes, it's me. Would you like to join me?" Mr. Chen nodded, taking the seat across from her. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I just wanted to say hello. You know, I've been meaning to tell you, you seem so much happier these days. It's wonderful to see." Alyssa felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. "Thank you, Mr. Chen. I am happier. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm truly living as myself." Mr. Chen nodded, embarrassed. "Understanding. That's all any of us can hope for, isn't it? To be true to ourselves and find happiness." He gestured to her laptop. "Are you working on something?" "I am," Alyssa said, unable to keep the excitement out of her voice. "I'm finishing up my first novel. It's being published next spring." Mr. Chen's eyes widened with delight. "That's wonderful news. Congratulations, Alyssa. What's the book about, if you don't mind me asking?" Alyssa took a deep breath. It's about someone like me, someone who struggles to find their place in the world, but ultimately finds the courage to be true to themselves. Mr. Chen reached out and patted her hand gently. "That sounds like a story a lot of people need to hear. I'm proud of you, Alyssa. It takes a lot of bravery to share your truth with the world." As Mr. Chen left, promising to buy a copy of her book as soon as it was released, Alyssa felt a surge of gratitude for how far she'd come. From the terrified person hiding in her apartment to a confident woman with a budding career and a story to tell, it had been quite a journey. That evening, as she was preparing for bed, Alyssa heard a knock at her door. She opened it to find Mrs. Harrington standing there, a small gift bag in her hands. "Mrs. Harrington?" Alyssa said warmly. "What a lovely surprise. Please come in." As they settled on the couch, Mrs. Harrington handed Alyssa the gift bag. "I hope you don't mind, dear, but I heard about your book deal. I wanted to bring you a little something to celebrate." Touched, Alyssa carefully opened the bag. Inside was a beautiful fountain pen, sleek and elegant. "Oh, Mrs. Harrington," she breathed. "It's beautiful. Thank you so much." Mrs. Harrington smiled, her eyes twinkling. "I thought you might like to use it to sign copies of your book when it's published. A proper author needs a proper pen, after all." Alyssa felt tears prick at her eyes. "I don't know what to say. You've done so much for me, Mrs. Harrington. I don't know where I'd be without your support." The older woman reached out and squeezed Alyssa's hand. "Nonsense, dear. All I did was give you a little push. You're the one who had the courage to take that first step and every step after. I'm so proud of the woman you've become." As they sat there chatting about Alyssa's book and her plans for the future, Alyssa felt a sense of peace wash over her. She thought back to that fateful evening when Mrs. Harrington had walked in on her. How terrified she'd been of being discovered. Now, here she was, living openly as herself, pursuing her dreams, and surrounded by people who loved and supported her. Later that night, as Alyssa stood in front of her mirror, she smiled at her reflection. The fountain pen Mrs. Harrington had given her rested on her nightstand, a gleaming symbol of her success, her book deal, and the life she was finally building for herself. Her heart swelled with pride and joy, emotions she'd only dreamed of feeling so fully in the past. She had spent so long hiding, so long afraid of judgment, but now the world was beginning to see her, to embrace her, and she was ready to embrace herself in ways she never had before. The publishing deal was more than just a professional triumph. It was a validation of her voice, her story, her truth. She felt invincible, radiant, like she could do anything. And tonight, she decided, she deserved to treat herself, to revel in her body, her desires, and the freedom she'd fought so hard to claim. She wanted to explore a side of herself she'd kept tucked away. Thanks for watching. The rest won't be viewable on YouTube, so check out Patreon if you want more. I hope you have a wonderful day, my cutie.